Millionaire mocked his maid for being naive, but collapsed when he discovered she was still a virgin. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She knew that staying invisible was safer, but some secrets refused to remain hidden. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Hart Mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, casting long shadows across marble floors that Danielle Moore had polished to perfection. At 25, she moved through the opulent rooms like a gentle ghost, her dark skin glowing softly in the amber sunlight that most people in this neighborhood took for granted. Danielle adjusted the fresh white orchids in the crystal vase, her slender fingers trembling slightly as footsteps echoed from the grand staircase. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Daniel Hart's presence filled every room he entered, suffocating and commanding, like expensive cologne that lingers long after its wearer has gone. "Still playing house, I see," Daniel's voice cut through the morning silence, sharp and dismissive. At 37, he carried himself like a man who had never heard the word no, his steel-grey eyes scanning the room as if calculating its worth. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit immaculate, but there was something cold about him that no amount of money could warm. Danielle kept her eyes downcast, continuing to arrange the flowers. "Good morning, Mr. Hart. Your breakfast is ready in the dining room." He approached her slowly, deliberately, his leather shoes clicking against the marble with each calculated step. "Tell me, Danielle," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like he was tasting something he found amusing. "Do you actually believe all those fairy tales you read in your spare time?" She paused, her hands stilling on the orchid stems. For a moment, something flickered in her warm brown eyes. Not anger, but a quiet strength that Daniel had never bothered to notice. "I believe that kindness exists, sir." Daniel laughed, but it was a hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Kindness. He repeated the word like it was foreign. How refreshingly naive. "In the real world, Danielle, kindness is just another word for weakness." From the doorway, a weathered voice interrupted. "Is that what you've learned in all your years, nephew?" Edward Hart, 68 and wise in ways that money couldn't buy, entered the room with the quiet dignity of a man who had loved deeply and lost greatly. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his kind eyes held depths that spoke of understanding earned through decades of living. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Uncle Edward, I didn't realize you were awake." "I've been awake for quite some time," Edward replied, his gaze moving between his nephew and the young woman who continued arranging flowers as if she were invisible. "Long enough to hear your morning sermon on the futility of human decency." Danielle felt the tension thicken in the air like smoke. She'd witnessed countless exchanges between the Hart men, Daniel's sharp cynicism always clashing with Edward's gentle wisdom. But today felt different. Today, she could feel Edward's eyes on her, really seeing her, in a way that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Danielle," Edward said softly, "those orchids are beautiful. You have a gift for bringing life into sterile places." The compliment hit her like a physical touch. She looked up, meeting Edward's kind eyes for just a moment before glancing away. "Thank you, Mr. Edward." Daniel rolled his eyes. "She arranges flowers, Uncle. Let's not canonize her for basic housework." But Edward stepped closer to the arrangement, his weathered hands gentle as he touched one of the pristine white petals. "These particular orchids are phalaenopsis. They're known for their resilience. They can bloom for months with the right care, fragile in appearance but remarkably strong." His eyes found Danielle's. "Much like people, I think." Danielle's breath caught. In 3 years of working in this house, no one had ever compared her to something beautiful. She felt tears prick at her eyes and quickly looked down, her hands smoothing over her simple black dress. Daniel watched this exchange with growing irritation. There was something in his chest, an unfamiliar tightness that he didn't like. "If you're both finished with this botanical poetry session, I have a conference call in 10 minutes. "Of course you do," Edward said quietly. "Always another call, another meeting, another reason to avoid simply being present." The older man turned to leave but paused in the doorway. "Danielle, would you mind bringing my coffee to the study when you have a moment? I find I prefer it when it's served by someone who understands that small kindnesses matter." When Edward's footsteps faded down the hall, Daniel and Danielle were left alone in the vast room. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with everything they had never said to each other. "You don't have to encourage his sentimentality," Daniel said finally, His voice quieter now, almost uncertain. Danielle looked up at him, really looked, for the first time in months. She saw the expensive suit, the perfectly styled hair, the sharp jawline that spoke of genetic privilege. But for just a moment she thought she glimpsed something else, something lonely and carefully hidden. "Your uncle is a kind man," she said simply. "The world could use more kindness." Daniel stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "And what would you know about the world, Danielle? You live in this bubble, arranging flowers and believing in fairy tales." She straightened, and in that moment, she looked less like a servant and more like a queen. "I know that every morning you eat breakfast alone in a room that seats 12. I know that you work 16-hour days to avoid coming home to silence. And I know that kindness isn't weakness, Mr. Hart. It's courage." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Daniel's phone buzzed, breaking the spell. He glanced at it, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "My conference call," he said, but he didn't move. "Yes, sir." He walked toward the door, then stopped. Without turning around, he said, "The orchids, they do look nice." It was barely a compliment, grudgingly given, but something in Danielle's heart fluttered like wings. As his footsteps faded up the stairs, she touched one of the orchid petals Edward had admired, fragile in appearance but remarkably strong. Maybe, she thought, there was truth in that comparison. But what she didn't know was that upstairs, Daniel Hart stood at his office window, staring down at the street below, unable to stop thinking about the quiet strength in her voice when she'd called kindness courage. And in that moment, both their worlds began to shift, though neither was ready to admit it. What would you do if someone challenged everything you believed about strength and weakness? 3 days had passed since their conversation, but some words echo longer than others. Daniel Hart stared at the same paragraph in his quarterly report for the 4th time, the numbers blurring together like abstract art. His corner office on the 42nd floor offered a commanding view of Manhattan, but today the city looked grey and uninspiring. He pushed back from his mahogany desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the urban landscape below. "Kindness isn't weakness, Mr. Hart. It's courage." Her words had been haunting him for 3 days now, slipping into his thoughts during board meetings, echoing in the silence of his penthouse apartment. Daniel Hart, who prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize and control, found himself unable to shake the memory of Danielle Moore's unwavering gaze. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Hart, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." "Send them in," he replied, straightening his tie and forcing his mind back to business. Meanwhile, across town in the Hart mansion, Danielle hummed softly as she dusted the antique photographs lining the hallway. Her melody was gentle, almost ethereal, a gospel hymn her grandmother had taught her years ago. The music seemed to breathe life into the sterile corridor, transforming it from a museum into something resembling a home. "That's a beautiful song." Danielle turned to find Edward approaching, his silver-tipped cane tapping gently against the hardwood floor. His eyes held their usual warmth, but today there was something else, a protective concern that made her pulse quicken. "My grandmother used to sing it while she cooked," Danielle said, setting down her dustcloth. "She said music could heal hearts that medicine couldn't reach." Edward nodded slowly, his weathered hands resting on his cane. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. Tell me, Danielle, was she the one who taught you to see light in dark places?" The question caught her off guard. She studied Edward's face, searching for hidden meaning. "What do you mean, Mr. Edward?" "I've watched you in this house for 3 years," he said, settling into an antique chair near the window. "You move through Daniel's storms like they're mere spring rain. That kind of grace isn't common." Danielle felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Your nephew isn't as terrible as he wants people to believe." Edward's eyebrows rose slightly. "Isn't he?" "No, sir." She picked up her cloth again, needing something to do with her hands. "Yesterday I found a stack of anonymous donations to children's hospitals on his desk. And last month, when Mrs. Holloway from down the street couldn't afford her medication, her pharmacy bill was mysteriously paid in full." "You notice things," Edward observed. "I notice everything," she admitted quietly. "It's what happens when you live on the edges of other people's lives." Edward was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. "Danielle, may I ask you something personal?" Her hands stilled on the picture frame she was dusting, a photograph of Daniel at his college graduation, his smile genuine and unguarded in a way she'd never seen in person. "Yes, sir." "Have you ever been in love?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She set down the frame carefully, buying herself time. No, sir. Not really. Not really. Or not at all. Danielle's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Not at all. I've been waiting for what? For someone who sees me, really sees me. Not just what I can do for them, but who I am. Edward leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. And what if that person was closer than you think? What if he was just too stubborn, too afraid to admit it? Before Danielle could respond, the front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Heavy footsteps echoed through the foyer, moving with the aggressive purpose of a man at war with the world. "Uncle Daniel!" Daniel's voice boomed through the mansion, sharp with frustration. Edward and Danielle exchanged glances. "Sounds like the quarterly board meeting didn't go well," Edward murmured. Daniel appeared in the hallway doorway, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed from running his hands through it, and his grey eyes blazed with barely contained fury. "Those incompetent—" He stopped abruptly when he saw Danielle, his angry words dying in his throat. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his features before the mask of control slammed back into place. "Rough day?" Edward asked mildly. "Harrison Industries backed out of the merger," Daniel said through gritted teeth. 6 months of negotiations down the drain because their CEO decided my corporate philosophy was too aggressive. Danielle watched him pace the hallway like a caged animal, his frustration radiating off him in waves. Without thinking, she said, "Maybe he was afraid you'd be too difficult to work with." Daniel stopped pacing and turned to stare at her. "Excuse me?" Edward rose from his chair, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Perhaps I should—" "No," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving Danielle's face. "I'd like to hear what our resident philosopher has to say about my business practices." Danielle felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she lifted her chin. "I didn't mean to overstep, but you did. So finish your thought." The air between them crackled with tension. Edward watched this exchange like a chess master observing a crucial game, saying nothing but missing nothing. "I just think," Danielle said carefully, "that maybe people respond better to partnership than domination. Your uncle told me about the children's hospital donations and Mrs. Holloway's medication. You're capable of kindness, Mr. Hart. Maybe if you let people see that side of you—" Daniel's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about business, Danielle." "No," she agreed quietly, "but I know about people, and people want to be seen as partners, not obstacles to overcome." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Daniel's expression shifted through several emotions: anger, frustration, and something else that looked almost like longing. "My kindness," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous, "is not a business strategy. I never said it was." "Then what are you saying?" Danielle took a small step toward him, her courage surprising even herself. "I'm saying that the man who anonymously pays for strangers' medical bills might find more success if he stopped hiding behind anger." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his breathing slightly labored. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked toward his study, slamming the door behind him. Edward whistled low under his breath. "Well, that was interesting." Danielle sank against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. "I shouldn't have said those things." "On the contrary," Edward said, his eyes twinkling with something that looked like hope, "I think you said exactly what he needed to hear." From behind the closed study door came the sound of something heavy hitting the wall, followed by Daniel's muffled cursing. "He hates me now," Danielle whispered. Edward smiled and patted her shoulder gently. "My dear girl, that wasn't hate in his eyes. That was a man meeting his match for the very first time." As Edward walked away, Danielle remained in the hallway, staring at the closed study door. Inside, she could hear Daniel moving around, and she wondered what storms were raging behind those walls. What she didn't know was that on the other side of that door, Daniel Hart was staring at his reflection in the window, replaying every word she'd spoken, and realizing that for the first time in his adult life, someone had seen straight through his carefully constructed armor. Sometimes the most dangerous conversations happen in the quiet hours after midnight. 2 weeks had passed since their confrontation in the hallway, and the Hart mansion had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Daniel emerged from his study only for meals, his interactions with Danielle reduced to polite nods and carefully neutral expressions. But Danielle noticed everything: the way his coffee sat untouched each morning, the dark circles under his eyes, the stack of crumpled papers in his wastebasket that suggested sleepless nights spent wrestling with thoughts he couldn't organize. It was approaching midnight when Danielle descended the grand staircase, her bare feet silent against the cool marble. She'd been unable to sleep, her mind replaying Edward's words about people being closer than they seemed. The mansion felt different at night, less like a showpiece and more like a home holding its breath. She padded toward the kitchen, seeking the comfort of chamomile tea, when she noticed a sliver of light beneath the study door. Her steps slowed. Daniel never worked this late anymore, not since the failed merger had shaken something loose in his carefully constructed world. A sound from within made her freeze. Not the click of computer keys or rustle of papers, but something raw and broken. A sound like a man coming apart at the seams. Without thinking, she knocked softly. The sounds inside stopped immediately. "Go away, Uncle Edward." "It's not Edward," she said quietly through the heavy oak door. "It's Danielle." Silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, barely audible, "What do you want?" "I heard." She pressed her palm against the door, as if she could reach through the wood to touch whatever pain she'd witnessed. "Are you all right?" A bitter laugh echoed from within. "Shouldn't you be sleeping? Tomorrow's another day of watching me fail at being human." The cruelty in his voice was aimed at himself, not her, and somehow that made it worse. "Mr. Hart, please, let me help." "Help?" The word came out sharp, cutting. "How exactly do you propose to help someone who spent 37 years perfecting the art of pushing people away?" Danielle closed her eyes, gathering courage from somewhere deep inside. "By not going away when you push." Another long silence, then the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy. The lock clicked, and the door opened just wide enough to reveal Daniel's face. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his white shirt wrinkled and open at the collar, but it was his eyes that stole her breath, vulnerable and lost in a way that made her chest ache. "You should go back to bed," he said, but he didn't close the door. "So should you." She studied his face in the dim hallway light. "When did you last sleep? Really sleep?" He rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking older than his years. "Sleep is overrated. So is suffering alone." The words hung between them like a bridge she'd just built from her heart to his. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then stepped back, opening the door wider. It was an invitation he'd never extended to anyone. Danielle entered the study cautiously, as if stepping into sacred space. The room was Daniel's sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather furniture worn soft with age, and a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to 3 generations of Hart men. But tonight it felt different, vulnerable, human. She noticed immediately what he'd been doing. Scattered across the desk were photographs, old ones, new ones, images that told the story of a life lived in careful isolation. His parents' wedding portrait, his Harvard graduation, pictures of business achievements that should have brought joy, but somehow looked hollow under the lamplight. "I was trying to figure out when I became this," he said, gesturing vaguely at himself. "This person who thinks kindness is weakness and emotions are liabilities." Danielle moved closer to the desk, her eyes taking in the scattered memories. "What did you find?" "That I've been this way for so long. I'm not sure who I'd be without the armor." He sank into his leather chair, looking defeated. "You said I hide behind anger. You weren't wrong." She picked up a photograph, Daniel as a child, maybe 8 years old, laughing while Edward pushed him on a tire swing. The joy in his face was pure and unguarded, so different from the man before her now. "You weren't born angry," she said softly. "No, I learned it." He took the photograph from her hands, his fingers tracing the edges. "My father believed emotions were weaknesses to be conquered. Hart men don't cry, Daniel. Hart men don't show fear. Hart men take what they want and never apologize for their strength." Danielle felt her heart break a little. "You were just a child who learned that love was conditional, that affection had to be earned through achievement and maintained through perfection." He set the photograph down carefully. "Uncle Edward tried to counteract it, but my father's voice was louder. And now," Daniel looked up at her, and in his grey eyes she saw decades of loneliness. "Now I'm 37 years old, and I built an empire, but can't build a relationship. I can negotiate billion-dollar deals, but can't have a simple conversation without turning it into a battle." Danielle found herself moving around the desk, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand. "That's not true, isn't it? Name one person who genuinely cares about me, not my money or my connections." "Edward. Edward's family. He has to care." "I don't." The words slipped out before she could stop them, honest and unguarded. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes searching her face as if looking for the lie. "You don't what?" "I don't have to care. she whispered, her courage surprising even herself. But I do. The air in the room shifted, becoming charged with something neither of them had names for. Daniel stood slowly, his movements careful, as if sudden gestures might shatter whatever fragile thing was building between them. Why? His voice was barely audible. Because underneath all that anger, you're kind. Because you pay for strangers' medical bills and pretend it never happened. Because you're gentle with Edward, even when you're frustrated with the world. Because you're not the monster you think you are. Daniel took a step toward her, then stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. Danielle, yes, I've spent 3 years barely seeing you, and now I can't stop thinking about you. What does that make me? Her breath caught. Human. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't know how to be human, not with you, not when you look at me like that. Like what? Like you see something worth saving. Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs as she took a small step closer. What if there is? The question hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. Daniel's eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, and she could see him fighting himself. You should go, he said finally, his voice strained. Before I do something we'll both regret. But Danielle didn't move. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand, just briefly, just enough to let him know he wasn't alone. What if we wouldn't regret it? Daniel closed his eyes, her touch burning through him like fire. When he opened them again, there was something new there, something that looked like hope fighting with fear. And in that moment, both of them realized they were standing at the edge of something that could either save them or destroy everything they thought they knew about themselves. Some nights change everything, but mornings have a way of bringing doubt back into the light. Danielle woke before dawn, her heart still racing from dreams filled with grey eyes and whispered confessions. The memory of Daniel's hand under hers felt so real, she had to look at her palm to convince herself it had actually happened. 3 hours of sleep had done nothing to dim the electricity that had crackled between them in his study, or the way he'd looked at her like she was both his salvation and his destruction. She dressed carefully in her usual black uniform, but her hands trembled as she buttoned the crisp white collar. Everything felt different now. The weight of the fabric against her skin, the sound of her footsteps on the marble floors, even the way the morning light filtered through the mansion's windows. She was still the same Danielle Moore who had entered that study last night, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between heartbeats. The kitchen was her sanctuary, and she lost herself in the familiar ritual of preparing breakfast. Coffee, dark and strong, the way Daniel preferred it. Fresh fruit arranged with the precision that had become second nature. Toast cut diagonally, butter on the side. Normal things. Safe things. Things that didn't require her to think about the way her name had sounded on his lips when he'd whispered it like a prayer. You're up early. Danielle spun around, nearly dropping the silver coffee pot. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway, and her breath caught. He was impeccably dressed again, charcoal suit, silver tie, every hair in place, but his eyes held the memory of last night's vulnerability. The carefully constructed mask was back, but she could see the cracks where emotion had broken through. I always get up early, Mr. Hart, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel. The correction hung between them like a bridge. She'd called him Mr. Hart for 3 years, maintaining the proper distance between employer and employee. But after last night, after touching his hand and seeing his soul laid bare, the formality felt like a lie. Daniel, she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. Something flickered in his expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. About last night. You don't have to explain, she interrupted quickly. I know you were tired, and emotions were high. Danielle, her name stopped her words cold. Don't. Don't what? Don't give me an excuse to take it back. He stepped into the kitchen, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Expensive and masculine, with hints of cedar and something darker. I meant what I said. Every word. Her hands tightened on the coffee pot. Which part? All of it. That I can't stop thinking about you. That you see something in me worth saving. That you scare me more than any business deal ever has. The honesty in his voice made her knees weak. Daniel, I've been awake all night, he continued, moving closer still, trying to convince myself that this is a mistake, that I'm your employer and you're... What? The question came out sharper than she intended. What am I, Daniel? He stopped, something shifting in his expression. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for. The words hit her like a physical blow. She set the coffee pot down with shaking hands, afraid she might drop it. You can't say things like that. Why not? Because, she struggled to find words that made sense, because I'm not like other women you've known. I'm not sophisticated or worldly or... Thank God for that. The fervor in his voice surprised them both. Do you know what sophisticated and worldly gets you, Danielle? Relationships built on mutual benefit, conversations that never go deeper than stock prices and social calendars, women who see dollar signs when they look at me. And what do you think I see? Daniel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed her cheek with reverent gentleness. I think you see me, just me, and that terrifies me because I haven't been just me in so long. I'm not sure he still exists. From the doorway, a throat cleared deliberately. Edward appeared, leaning on his silver-tipped cane, his knowing eyes taking in the scene with poorly concealed amusement. Good morning, he said mildly. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Daniel's hand dropped from Danielle's face, but he didn't step away. Uncle Edward, you're up early. Old habits, Edward replied, his gaze moving between them with satisfaction. I find that the early morning hours often bring the most illuminating conversations. Danielle felt heat flood her cheeks. I'll get your coffee, Mr. Edward. No rush, my dear. I was just going to suggest that Daniel might want to cancel his 9 o'clock meeting with the Pemberton group. Daniel frowned. Why would I do that? Because, Edward said with the patience of a man who had lived long enough to understand the importance of timing, some conversations are more important than business deals, and some opportunities don't wait for convenient scheduling. The older man's eyes met Danielle's briefly, and she saw encouragement there, understanding. Permission to claim something she'd never dared want. I should let you both, Danielle began, moving toward the door. Stay. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. Please. Edward smiled and settled into a chair at the breakfast table. Actually, I think Danielle should stay too. In fact, I think we all need to have a conversation about honesty. Uncle... No, Daniel, sit down. Both of you. Edward's voice carried the authority of age and wisdom. For 3 years, I've watched you dance around each other like opposing magnets, drawn together but afraid to get too close. Last night, something changed. I could feel it in the very walls of this house. Danielle and Daniel exchanged glances, neither sitting nor speaking. Danielle, Edward continued gently, you've spent 3 years believing you're invisible in this house. And Daniel, you've spent the same 3 years pretending she is. But pretending doesn't make truth disappear. It just makes it more dangerous when it finally surfaces. What are you saying? Daniel asked. Edward's eyes twinkled with something that looked like mischief. I'm saying that life is too short for cowardice. And love... He paused, letting the words settle in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Love requires courage. Danielle's breath caught. Mr. Edward, I don't think... That you love my nephew? Edward's voice was gentle, but knowing. My dear child, it's written all over your face. It has been for months. Daniel turned to stare at her, his expression shifting through surprise, hope, and something that looked like wonder. Danielle, she felt exposed, vulnerable, like Edward had just stripped away her last defense. I need some air. She fled toward the garden doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she heard Daniel call her name, but she couldn't stop, couldn't face the intensity in his eyes, or the knowing smile on Edward's face. The morning air was cool against her heated skin, and she pressed her palms against her cheeks, trying to calm her racing pulse. Love. Edward had said the word like it was simple, natural, inevitable. But love was dangerous. Love meant vulnerability. Love meant trusting someone with the most fragile parts of yourself. Danielle. She turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his expression raw and uncertain. Don't run from me, not now. I'm not running. Then what are you doing? She looked up at him. This complicated, damaged man who paid for strangers' medical bills and hid his kindness like a shameful secret. I'm trying to figure out how someone like me falls in love with someone like you. The admission hung between them like a confession, and Daniel realized that everything he thought he knew about want and need, and forever, was about to change. When love is finally spoken aloud, there's no taking it back, and some truths demand to be heard. Daniel stood frozen in the garden doorway, Danielle's words echoing in his mind like church bells. Someone like me falls in love with someone like you. She had said it so simply, as if love was just another fact to be acknowledged, like the color of the sky or the turning of seasons. But her eyes told a different story. They held the fear of a woman who had just handed her heart to someone who might not know how to hold it gently. Someone like you, he repeated slowly, stepping out into the morning air. What does that mean? Danielle wrapped her arms around herself. suddenly cold despite the warming sun. It means I'm a housekeeper who fell in love with her employer. It means I'm a girl from Brooklyn who dreams about fairy tales while living in someone else's mansion. It means I'm perfect. The word stopped her breath. Daniel moved closer, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the world seem smaller, quieter, like they were the only two people left in existence. "You're perfect," he said again, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm the man who's been too proud and too scared to admit that I fell in love with you months ago." Danielle's knees nearly buckled. "Daniel, I love the way you hum while you work. I love that you see kindness as strength instead of weakness. I love that you arrange flowers like you're creating something sacred." He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "I love that you called me on my anger and didn't back down when I tried to intimidate you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, warm and unstoppable. "You don't understand? Then help me understand." She pulled back, creating distance that felt necessary and painful all at once. "There are things about me you don't know, things that might change how you feel. Try me." The challenge in his voice was gentle but unwavering. Danielle looked back toward the house, where she could see Edward watching them through the kitchen window, his expression encouraging but patient. She thought about her grandmother's voice, about the songs that had taught her to believe in love even when it seemed impossible. "I've never—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat like thorns. "Never what?" "I've never been with anyone." The confession came out in a rush, barely audible. "Not like that, not at all." Daniel's expression didn't change immediately, as if his mind needed time to process what she'd said. Then his eyes widened slightly, not with judgment or disappointment, but with something that looked like awe. "You mean—" "I'm 25 years old, and I've never been kissed. Never been held by someone who loved me. Never." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "I told you there were things that might change how you feel." Daniel was quiet for so long that Danielle began to panic. She started to turn away, but his voice stopped her. "Danielle, look at me." Reluctantly, she met his eyes. What she saw there wasn't pity or awkwardness. It was reverence. "You've been waiting," he said softly. "For what?" "For someone who deserves it. For someone who sees you." He took a step closer, moving slowly as if approaching something precious and fragile. "You've been protecting something sacred." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Most men would see it as a burden. Most men are fools." His voice carried conviction that made her heart skip. "Do you know what I see?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who knows her worth, who refuses to settle for anything less than real love, who's brave enough to wait for something that matters." He reached out, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "You're not inexperienced, Danielle. You're careful. There's a difference." "Daniel, I don't know how to—" "Neither do I." The admission surprised them both. "I've had relationships, but I've never been in love. Not real love, not the kind that scares you and saves you at the same time." From the kitchen window came the sound of Edward deliberately clearing his throat, followed by the pointed clink of a coffee cup against a saucer. Both Daniel and Danielle glanced toward the house, seeing the older man's knowing smile. "He's been orchestrating this, hasn't he?" Danielle asked. Daniel laughed softly. "Uncle Edward believes in what he calls divine intervention through strategic meddling. Is that what this is?" "I don't know what this is," Daniel admitted, "but I know what I want it to be." "What?" He cupped her face in both hands, his touch so gentle it made her ache. "I want it to be everything. I want to learn how to love you the way you deserve to be loved. I want to show you that not all men are interested in taking. Some of us want to give." Danielle closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I'm scared. So am I. But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of loving you." When she opened her eyes, she saw her own feelings reflected in his grey gaze. Love and fear and hope all tangled together like threads in an intricate tapestry. "If we do this," she whispered, "if we try this, you have to understand that I don't know the rules. I don't know how to play games or be sophisticated or—" "Good," Daniel said firmly. "I'm tired of games. I'm tired of sophisticated women who see me as a prize to be won instead of a person to be loved." "And what do you see when you look at me?" "Home," he said without hesitation. "I see home." The word hit her like a revelation. Home. Not a house or a mansion or a place where she worked, but a feeling, a person, a safe harbor in a world that had too often been cold and unwelcoming. "Daniel?" "Yes, I love you too." The words came easier this time, like a door that had been waiting to be opened. "I love you and it terrifies me, and I don't know what happens next." He smiled then, not his usual controlled, measured expression, but something genuine and radiant that transformed his entire face. What happens next is that we figure it out together, one day at a time, one moment at a time. Starting when? Starting now. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, time to change her mind, time to remember all the reasons this might be a mistake. But Danielle didn't move. Instead, she rose up on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, like a question being asked and answered simultaneously. It lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. The way they stood, the way they breathed, the way they looked at each other when they broke apart. "Was that—" Daniel began. "My first," she confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure it wasn't your best." As they stood in the garden, foreheads touching and hearts racing, neither of them noticed Edward watching from the window with tears in his eyes, finally seeing his nephew become the man he was always meant to be. The first day after I love you feels like walking on sacred ground. Everything familiar suddenly transformed. 3 days had passed since their first kiss, and Danielle found herself navigating uncharted territory with the careful steps of someone learning to dance. The mansion hadn't changed. The same marble floors, the same expensive art, the same morning routines, but everything felt different when viewed through the lens of love. Daniel's coffee cup seemed more important now that she knew he loved her hands preparing it. The hallways echoed differently when she knew he was listening for her footsteps. But love, she was discovering, came with its own complications. "You're overthinking again." Danielle looked up from the roses she'd been arranging for the 3rd time, finding Daniel standing in the doorway of the sunroom. He was dressed for work, navy suit, silver tie that brought out his eyes, but there was something softer about him now, as if love had smoothed the sharp edges of his perpetual tension. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though her hands stilled on the stems. He entered the room slowly, that new, careful consideration in every movement. They were still learning how to be around each other, now that everything had changed. "You've rearranged those roses 4 times in the past hour. Either they're particularly stubborn, or you're working through something." She looked down at the flowers, white roses mixed with baby's breath, elegant and timeless. "I was just trying to get them perfect. They were perfect the first time." Daniel stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, far enough away that he wasn't crowding her. This dance of proximity was new for both of them. "What's really bothering you?" Danielle set down the rose in her hand and turned to face him. "Mrs. Holloway came by this morning." Daniel's expression shifted slightly. "The neighbor whose medication was paid for? She wanted to thank whoever had helped her. She brought homemade cookies and—" Danielle paused, gathering courage. "She asked if I knew who the angel was, who'd saved her from having to choose between her heart medication and her rent." "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that some angels prefer to remain anonymous." Danielle studied his face, noting the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "But it made me think." "About what?" "About how little I really know about you. About the man behind the expensive suits and the charity you hide like secrets." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes distant. "There's not much to know." "I don't believe that." Danielle reached out, her fingers brushing his hand in a touch that was still new enough to send electricity through both of them. "Tell me something real, something that made you who you are." He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing across her knuckles with reverent attention. "When I was 12, my father fired our housekeeper, a woman named Constance who'd worked for our family for 8 years. She was getting older, slower, and he decided she was no longer efficient enough to justify her salary." Danielle waited, sensing there was more. "I found her crying in the kitchen on her last day. She had 2 grandchildren she was helping to raise, and losing the job meant they might have to drop out of school." Daniel's voice grew quieter. "That night I heard my father laughing about it on the phone with a business partner, talking about how sentiment was the enemy of success. What did you do?" "Nothing. I was 12 and powerless." His eyes met hers. "But I promised myself that when I had power I'd use it differently. Every anonymous donation, every mysteriously paid bill, it's me trying to be the man my father wasn't." Danielle felt her heart swell with love and sadness in equal measure. "You're nothing like him." "Sometimes I think I am. The anger, the control, the way I push people away when they get too close." "But you didn't push me away." "No," he agreed softly. "I didn't, though God knows I tried." From the hallway came the sound of Edward's approaching footsteps, accompanied by the gentle tap of his cane. Both Daniel and Danielle stepped apart instinctively, the habit of maintaining proper distance still strong despite everything that had changed between them. "Good morning, you two." Edward said as he entered the sunroom, his knowing eyes taking in their careful positioning with amusement. Am I interrupting another moment of profound conversation disguised as flower arranging? Daniel cleared his throat. Uncle, we were just falling more in love with each passing day? Edward settled into his favorite chair by the window, his expression pleased. Yes, I can see that. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? Danielle felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Edward, I should probably— Stay, Edward said firmly. Both of you need to hear this. He looked between them with the patience of a man who had lived long enough to understand the complexities of the heart. You're both dancing around each other like you're made of spun glass. Love isn't that fragile, children. We're taking things slowly, Daniel said. Why? The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel and Danielle exchanged glances, neither quite sure how to answer. Because it's the right thing to do, Danielle said finally. According to whom? Edward's voice was gentle but pointed. You're both adults, you're both in love. Life is short and happiness is rare. What exactly are you waiting for? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that was becoming familiar to Danielle. It's complicated, Uncle. Love always is. But that doesn't mean it has to be tortured. Edward leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on his cane. Let me tell you something about waiting. I waited to tell my Margaret I loved her. Waited for the perfect moment, the perfect words, the perfect circumstances. You know what happened. Neither of them answered, but both were listening intently. I almost lost her to a man who was brave enough to act on his feelings immediately. If she hadn't chosen me despite my cowardice, I would have spent my life wondering what if. His eyes moved between them. Don't make my mistake. What are you suggesting? Daniel asked. I'm suggesting that you stop treating your love like it's something to be ashamed of. Stop hiding it, stop tiptoeing around it. Stop acting like caring for each other is somehow improper. Edward's voice grew stronger. You're in love. Celebrate it. Danielle felt tears prick her eyes. It's not that simple, isn't it? Edward's gaze softened as he looked at her. My dear girl, you've spent your whole life believing you weren't worthy of love like this. And Daniel, you've spent yours believing you weren't capable of it. You're both wrong. Daniel reached out then, his fingers intertwining with Danielle's in full view of his uncle. The gesture was simple but revolutionary, a public claiming that made Danielle's heart race. What would you have us do? Daniel asked. Edward smiled, his eyes twinkling with something that looked like mischief. Love each other openly. Stop hiding from what makes you happy. He paused, studying their joined hands. And perhaps it's time to discuss some practical matters, such as the fact that Danielle is far more than a housekeeper, and perhaps it's time her position in this household reflected that reality. Danielle's breath caught. Mr. Edward, what are you saying? I'm saying, my dear, that the woman my nephew loves deserves better than to be hidden away like a shameful secret. And I'm saying that this old house could use some permanent joy in its halls. As his words settled over them like a benediction, Daniel and Danielle realized that Edward wasn't just giving them permission to love. He was challenging them to be brave enough to build a life together. Sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who understand us the least. The phone call came at precisely 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, shattering the newfound peace of the Hart mansion like crystal against stone. Danielle was in the library, dusting the leather-bound volumes that Daniel collected but rarely read, when she heard his voice echoing from the study, sharp, defensive, and filled with a tension she hadn't heard since their early days of careful animosity. That's none of your concern, Mother. Danielle's hands stilled on the bookspine. In 3 years of working in this house, she had never heard Daniel mention his parents, never seen family photographs beyond those scattered memories he'd shown her in his vulnerable moment. The woman on the other end of that call was a ghost from a past he'd buried so deep that even Edward rarely spoke of her. No, I will not be attending the charity gala, because I have other priorities now. What do you mean? What kind of priorities? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Danielle found herself moving closer to the study door, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. Through the crack, she could see Daniel pacing behind his desk, his free hand running through his hair with increasing agitation. Her name is none of your business. I don't care what people will think. Mother, I'm 37 years old, not 17. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Daniel's responses growing shorter and more clipped with each exchange. When he finally ended the call, the silence that followed felt dangerous, the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes. Danielle knocked softly on the doorframe. Daniel? He looked up, and the expression on his face made her heart clench. All the softness love had brought to his features was gone, replaced by the cold mask she remembered from their early encounters. But now she could see through it to the pain underneath. "My mother," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "I gathered that." Danielle entered the study cautiously, reading his body language like a map of potential landmines. "Are you all right?" "She knows." The words hit Danielle like ice water. "Knows what?" "About us." Apparently Mrs. Holloway mentioned to someone at the grocery store that there seemed to be romance blooming at the Hart mansion. "Word travels fast in certain circles." Danielle's laugh was bitter. "My mother has her sources everywhere." Danielle felt her stomach drop. "What did she say?" "The usual, that I'm making a fool of myself, that people are talking, that a Hart doesn't associate with—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching. "With what, Daniel?" "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." Danielle moved closer, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "What did she say about me?" Daniel met her eyes and she saw regret and rage warring in his expression. "She called you the help." The words landed like physical blows. Danielle had heard worse in her life, had endured countless subtle and not-so-subtle reminders of her place in the world, but somehow coming from the mother of the man she loved, it cut deeper than expected. "I see." "Danielle." "No, it's fine." She straightened her shoulders, calling on reserves of dignity she'd learned to access in moments like these. "She's not wrong, technically. I am the help. You're not." Daniel's voice was fierce, protective. "You're the woman I love." Those things aren't mutually exclusive. The sadness in her voice seemed to break something in Daniel. He moved around the desk, reaching for her, but she stepped back instinctively. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not when you're looking at me like you're ashamed." "I'm not ashamed of you, I'm ashamed of her." "Are you?" The question came out harder than she intended. "Because for a moment there, when you were talking to her, you sounded like the old Daniel, the one who thought kindness was weakness and love was a liability." Daniel flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not fair, isn't it? Your mother calls and suddenly you're pacing and angry and looking at me like I'm a problem to be solved, instead of a woman to be loved." From the doorway came the sound of Edward clearing his throat. Both Daniel and Danielle turned to find the older man standing there, his expression grave but unsurprised. "I take it Vivian called," Edward said simply. "You know?" Daniel's voice was sharp. "I've been expecting it. Your mother has never been able to resist inserting herself into situations that don't concern her." Edward entered the study, his cane tapping against the hardwood. "What did she want? For me to come to my senses, to remember my position in society, to stop embarrassing the family name." Edward's eyes flashed with something that looked like anger, an emotion Danielle had never seen from the gentleman. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her it was none of her business." "But—" Edward's voice carried the weight of a man who knew his nephew too well. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Edward and Danielle. "But she's threatening to come here, to assess the situation herself." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Danielle felt her chest tighten, her breathing becoming shallow. She had faced many challenges in her life: poverty, discrimination, the casual cruelty of people who saw her as invisible. But the thought of facing Daniel's mother felt insurmountable. "When?" Edward asked. "Tomorrow." Danielle sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Tomorrow." "Danielle, listen to me." Daniel knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. "It doesn't matter what she says or thinks. Nothing she can do will change how I feel about you." "Won't it?" Danielle looked into his eyes, searching for certainty she desperately needed to find. "Because 5 minutes ago you were angry at me for existing, for being someone she could use to hurt you." "I wasn't angry at you." "Yes, you were." Her voice was quiet but certain. "Maybe not consciously, but part of you was angry that loving me has consequences, that I come with complications your mother can exploit." Daniel opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again. The truth was there in his expression, unwelcome but undeniable. Edward watched this exchange with the sadness of a man who had witnessed too many families destroy themselves with pride and fear. "Danielle, my dear, may I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you love my nephew?" "Yes." "Enough to fight for him?" The question caught her off guard. She looked at Daniel, still kneeling beside her chair, his grey eyes holding a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that kind of fight." "You are," Edward said with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than any of us. The question is whether Daniel is strong enough to deserve you." Daniel's head snapped up. Uncle! No, Daniel. This is the moment that matters. Your mother is coming here tomorrow to try to destroy the best thing that's ever happened to you. The question is, what are you going to do about it? As the weight of Edward's challenge settled over the room, Danielle realized that tomorrow would determine not just the future of her relationship with Daniel, but whether the man she loved was truly the man she believed him to be. She arrived like winter, unexpected, cutting, and determined to freeze everything beautiful in its path. Vivienne Hart stepped out of her black Mercedes at exactly 11 a.m., her Louboutin heels clicking against the mansion's marble steps with the precision of a metronome. At 62, she was still striking, silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, Chanel suit tailored to perfection, diamonds glinting at her throat like small cold stars. But it was her eyes that revealed her true nature, pale blue ice that had never learned the warmth of genuine affection. Danielle watched from the upstairs window, her hands gripping the silk curtains until her knuckles went white. She had barely slept, spending the night alternating between rehearsing conversations that would never happen and imagining scenarios that made her stomach churn with anxiety. Daniel had knocked on her door 3 times during the night, but she hadn't answered. Some battles required solitude to prepare for. She looks exactly like I imagined, Danielle whispered to herself, taking in the woman's imperious posture and calculating gaze as Vivienne surveyed the mansion like a general inspecting troops. The front door opened with ceremonial gravitas, and Danielle heard the formal exchange of greetings below. Daniel's voice was carefully controlled, Edward's warmly polite, but Vivienne's responses were crisp and businesslike, as if she were conducting a corporate audit rather than visiting family. Where is she? Vivienne's voice carried clearly up the stairwell, sharp and commanding. Where is who, mother? Daniel's response was deliberately obtuse. Don't play games with me, Daniel. The girl. I want to meet the person who's caused such a stir in our social circle. Danielle closed her eyes, drawing strength from her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. Stand tall, baby girl. Your worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. She descended the staircase slowly, each step deliberate and dignified. Her black dress was simple but elegant, her hair swept back to reveal the graceful line of her neck. She wore no jewelry except for small pearl earrings, a gift from Edward on her last birthday. She looked exactly like what she was, a beautiful, intelligent woman who happened to work in service. The conversation in the foyer stopped as she appeared. Vivienne's pale eyes swept over Danielle from head to toe, cataloguing and dismissing in a single devastating glance. So you're the famous Danielle, Vivienne said, her voice carrying the kind of false warmth that preceded a knife thrust. You're prettier than I expected. Thank you, Mrs. Hart. Danielle's voice was steady, respectful, but not subservient. It's a pleasure to meet you. Is it? Vivienne moved closer, circling Danielle like a predator studying prey. Tell me, dear, how long have you been working for my son? 3 years, Mum. And in those 3 years you've managed to convince him that he's in love with you. That's quite an accomplishment. The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound. Daniel stepped forward, his jaw clenched. Mother, I'm not finished. Vivienne held up a manicured hand without taking her eyes off Danielle. I'm curious about your background, dear. Where did you go to school? I graduated from Brooklyn Community College with a degree in literature. How practical. And your family? My grandmother raised me. She passed away 5 years ago. I see. No family, modest education, working in domestic service. Vivienne's smile was razor-thin. And yet you believe you're suitable for a heart. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward gripped his cane tighter, his knuckles white with suppressed anger. Daniel looked ready to explode, but Danielle held up a subtle hand asking for space to fight her own battle. I don't believe I'm suitable for anything, Mrs. Hart, Danielle said quietly. I believe I'm a human being worthy of love and respect, regardless of my bank account or pedigree. Your son seems to agree with that assessment. Vivienne's eyes flashed with something dangerous. My son is infatuated. Men his age often are, especially with women who know how to appeal to their baser instincts. The insult hit its mark, but Danielle didn't flinch. If you're suggesting what I think you are, you're wrong. Daniel and I haven't what? Slept together? Vivienne's laugh was cold and knowing. How refreshingly old-fashioned, though I suppose that's part of the appeal, isn't it? Playing the innocent while you systematically dismantle my son's judgment. That's enough. Daniel's voice cut through the air like a blade. I will not speak to her that way. I will speak however I choose in my own family's home. This isn't your home anymore, Edward said quietly, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority. And it hasn't been for 20 years. Vivian turned her cold gaze on her brother-in-law. Still playing the sentimental fool, Edward? Some things never change. You're right, Edward replied, his voice steady as granite. Some things never change. Your cruelty, for instance. Your inability to see worth in anyone who doesn't serve your ambitions. My ambitions built this empire. Your husband's ambitions built this empire, Edward corrected. Your only contribution was teaching your son to be as cold and calculating as you are. Fortunately, that lesson didn't take. The words hung in the air like thrown gauntlets. Vivian's composure cracked slightly, revealing the rage beneath her polished surface. Daniel, she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, you have a choice to make. Your family and your future, or this dalliance with the help. Daniel looked at his mother, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in years. He saw the expensive clothes and perfect makeup, the studied elegance and practiced charm. But underneath it all, he saw something that chilled him. Emptiness. A void where warmth and love should have lived. Then he looked at Danielle. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. She stood there taking his mother's verbal assault with a grace that humbled him, defending not just herself, but the very idea that love could transcend social boundaries. You're right, Mother, Daniel said slowly. I do have a choice to make. Danielle's breath caught. Vivian's smile was triumphant. I choose Danielle. The words hit the foyer like thunder. Vivian's face went white with shock and fury. If you think I'll stand by and watch you throw away everything for some delusional fantasy, then don't stand by, Daniel said, moving to Danielle's side and taking her trembling hand in his. Leave. Go back to your empty penthouse and your empty friendships and your empty life. But don't expect me to join you there. Vivian stared at her son, as if seeing a stranger. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. No, Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. The biggest mistake of my life was waiting 37 years to realize that your approval isn't worth sacrificing my happiness. The silence that followed was electric with unspoken consequences. Vivian looked between Daniel and Danielle, then at Edward, searching for an ally she wouldn't find. This isn't over, she said finally, her voice deadly quiet. Yes, it is, Edward replied. It's been over for a long time. We were just too polite to tell you. Vivian Hart left the way she had arrived, with calculated precision and cold fury. But as her Mercedes pulled away from the mansion, the woman watching from the upstairs window wasn't the same one who had arrived. Something fundamental had shifted in the Hart family dynamic, and everyone in that foyer knew it. As the sound of the car faded into the distance, Daniel turned to Danielle with love and determination burning in his eyes. But neither of them realized that Vivian Hart's threats were never empty, and her next move would test their love in ways they couldn't imagine. In the silence after the storm, truth has a way of revealing itself in the spaces between heartbeats. The mansion felt different after Vivian's departure, larger somehow, as if her toxic presence had been compressing the very walls. Danielle stood in the foyer, long after the Mercedes had disappeared, her hand still clasped in Daniel's, both of them processing what had just transpired. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the marble floor, where a family had just been irrevocably changed. I need some air, Danielle whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's grip on her hand tightened instinctively. Don't run from this. From us. I'm not running. She looked up at him, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears. I just need a moment to breathe, to understand what just happened. Edward, who had been standing silent as a sentinel during their exchange, stepped forward with the gentle authority of wisdom earned through decades. Perhaps we all need a moment to process. Daniel, give her space. But Danielle, he added, his weathered hand reaching out to touch her shoulder, don't let her poison convince you that you're anything less than extraordinary. Danielle nodded, unable to trust her voice, and walked toward the garden doors. But she didn't go far, just to the stone bench beneath the old oak tree where she and Daniel had shared their first kiss. She could feel both men watching her through the windows, protective and patient, giving her the space she needed while remaining close enough to catch her if she fell. Inside the mansion, Daniel paced the foyer like a caged animal, his earlier certainty giving way to the crushing weight of what his choice might cost them both. I've destroyed everything, he said suddenly, his voice raw with realization. My mother will make our lives hell. She has connections, influence, power to make things difficult for us, for Danielle. Stop, Edward's voice cut through his nephew's spiral with surgical precision. Right now, you sound exactly like the man who was too afraid to love her in the first place. Daniel spun around, his grey eyes wild. You don't understand what she's capable of. I understand perfectly. Your mother is a bitter woman who mistakes cruelty for strength and isolation for power. But you know what I also understand? Edward moved closer, his cane tapping against the marble with each deliberate step. I understand that the woman sitting in our garden just faced down a hurricane with more grace and courage than most people show in a lifetime. Through the window they could see Danielle sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the sky as if drawing strength from the fading light. She's stronger than you think, Edward continued. Stronger than your mother, certainly. The question is whether you're strong enough to be worthy of her strength. Daniel followed his uncle's gaze to the garden. What if I'm not? What if loving her isn't enough? What if I can't protect her from the world my mother represents? Then you learn, you grow. You become the man she believes you already are. Edward's voice gentled. Love isn't about protection, Daniel. It's about partnership. Stop trying to shield her from difficulties and start figuring out how to face them together. Outside, Danielle lifted her face to catch the last rays of sunlight, and in that moment, she looked like something sacred, a woman who had found her own strength and was no longer afraid to claim it. Go to her, Edward said quietly, and this time, don't go as her protector. Go as her equal. Daniel found Danielle exactly where he'd expected, beneath the oak tree, surrounded by the roses she tended with such care. She didn't look up when he approached, but she didn't pull away when he sat beside her on the stone bench. Your mother was right about one thing, Danielle said finally, her voice soft but steady. Daniel's blood went cold. What? I am just the help. I do work in domestic service. I don't have a trust fund or a pedigree or connections in high society. She turned to look at him, and he was struck by the calm certainty in her expression. But that doesn't make me less worthy of love. Danielle, let me finish. She placed her hand over his, the gesture tender but firm. For 3 years, I've lived in this house believing I was invisible, believing I was lucky just to be tolerated in these beautiful rooms. But today, when your mother tried to make me feel small, I realized something. What? I'm not small. I never was. I've been hiding my own light because I was afraid others would try to dim it. She smiled, and it was radiant. But love doesn't ask you to hide, Daniel. Love asks you to shine. Daniel stared at her, overwhelmed by the quiet revolution taking place before his eyes. This wasn't the uncertain young woman who had confessed her virginity with trembling hands. This was a woman who had faced judgment and emerged stronger, clearer, more herself than ever before. I love you, he said, the words inadequate but necessary. I love your strength, your grace, your refusal to let anyone diminish you. I love that you see goodness in a world that often shows you cruelty. And I love you, she replied, but not because you chose me over your mother. I love you because in choosing me, you finally chose yourself, the real you, the man who pays for strangers' medication and hides his kindness like a secret treasure. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands intertwined, watching the sky deepen from gold to amber to the soft purple of approaching dusk. What happens now? Danielle asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles. Now we build something new, something that's ours, not bound by other people's expectations or limitations. Your mother will make things difficult. Let her try. His voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. She spent her whole life believing that money and status are the only things that matter. She'll never understand that she just lost to something she can't buy or manipulate or control. What's that? Love. Real love. The kind that makes people brave enough to choose happiness over approval. As if summoned by their conversation, Edward appeared on the garden path, moving slowly but purposefully toward them. In his weathered hands he carried something that made both Daniel and Danielle straighten with sudden attention. Uncle? Daniel stood, helping Danielle to her feet. What is that? Edward's eyes twinkled with something that looked like mischief and destiny combined. This, he said, holding up a small velvet box that had clearly been treasured for decades, belonged to your grandmother, Daniel. She wore it for 63 years of marriage, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow. Daniel's breath caught. Uncle, you can't mean... I mean exactly what you think I mean. Edward looked between them with the satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to recognize true love when he saw it. Life is short, children. Too short for long engagements and elaborate planning. Too short to waste time on fear when you found something real. He placed the velvet box in Daniel's trembling hands. Your grandmother always said this ring would find its way to the woman who could love a heart man completely, flaws, fears, and all. Daniel opened the box with reverent fingers, revealing an antique diamond ring of breathtaking simplicity and elegance. It caught the dying light and threw it back in rainbow fragments, as if it had been waiting all these years to sparkle for the right woman. "Danielle Moore," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I know we've only just found each other. I know the world will tell us we're moving too fast, that we're too different, that this can't last." He dropped to one knee on the garden path, the velvet box open between them like a promise. "But I also know that some things are worth fighting for, worth believing in, worth building a life around. Will you marry me?" Some moments split time into before and after, and this was one of them. The world seemed to hold its breath as Daniel knelt on the garden path, the antique diamond ring catching the last rays of sunlight like captured stars. Danielle stared down at him, this man who had chosen love over legacy, who had found the courage to kneel in the same garden where he'd first kissed her and ask her to build forever with him. Time moved differently in that suspended moment. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel Edward's hopeful gaze from where he stood like a benevolent guardian, could see the vulnerability in Daniel's grey eyes as he waited for her answer. But underneath it all, she heard her grandmother's voice, gentle and knowing. "Love that asks you to be brave is the only love worth having, baby girl." Yes. The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every dream she'd never dared to speak aloud. Daniel's face transformed, relief and joy breaking across his features like sunrise after the longest night. "Yes," she said again, stronger this time, her voice carrying across the garden with absolute certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you." Daniel rose from his knees with hands that trembled as he slipped his grandmother's ring onto Danielle's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 25 years for her hand specifically. The diamond caught the light and sent rainbow fragments dancing across their faces, blessing them with tiny pieces of forever. "My God," Daniel whispered, staring at their joined hands. "You said yes. Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped, but hoping and knowing are different things." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss to the ring that now marked her as his. "I love you, Danielle Hart." The name hit her like a physical sensation. Danielle Hart. No longer invisible, no longer just the help, but the woman who would share his name, his life, his future. She tested it silently on her tongue and found it tasted like coming home. From behind them came the sound of enthusiastic applause. Edward was beaming, his eyes bright with tears he made no attempt to hide. 63 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That ring hasn't sparkled like that since the day my brother put it on your grandmother's finger, Daniel." She would be so proud. Daniel pulled Danielle close, his arms encircling her, as if he could protect her from every storm that might come. "When?" he asked, his lips close to her ear. "When can we make this real?" "It's already real," she murmured back. "This moment, this choice, this love, it's all real. I mean the wedding. I want you to be my wife, not just my fiancée. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're mine and I'm yours, completely and forever." Danielle pulled back to look into his eyes, seeing the desperation there, not born of doubt but of a man who had lived 37 years without knowing what home felt like and was now desperate to claim it. "Soon," she promised, "as soon as we can arrange it." "Tomorrow," she laughed, the sound bright and musical in the evening air. "Tomorrow might be rushing things, even for us. Next week?" "Daniel, I'm serious." His hands cupped her face with infinite tenderness. "I've wasted enough time pretending I didn't need love. I don't want to waste another day not being married to you." Edward cleared his throat delicately. "If I may suggest, there's a beautiful little chapel in the village. Father Morrison has been a family friend for decades. I'm sure he could arrange something intimate. This weekend, perhaps." Both Daniel and Danielle turned to stare at the older man, who looked remarkably pleased with himself. "You've been planning this," Daniel accused. "I've been hoping for this," Edward corrected. "There's a difference, but yes, I may have made a few preliminary inquiries, just in case." Danielle felt overwhelmed by the speed at which her life was changing. 3 weeks ago, she had been invisible. Today, she was engaged to the man she loved, with his uncle planning their wedding. It felt like stepping into someone else's life, someone braver, someone worthy of fairy tale endings. "What about your mother?" she asked suddenly, reality intruding on their perfect moment. "She'll never accept this. Never accept me." Daniel's expression hardened slightly, but not with doubt, with determination. "My mother made her choice today. She chose pride over love, judgment over acceptance. I've made mine. He touched the ring on her finger. I choose you. Always you. But the social implications, the business relationships, will survive. And if they don't, we'll build new ones. Better ones, with people who understand that love isn't a business transaction. Edward stepped closer, his weathered hand resting on both their shoulders. My dear children, let me tell you something about the Hart legacy. It was never about money or social standing or business empires. It was about love, about building something meaningful and lasting with the person who sees your soul. He gestured toward the mansion, golden in the evening light. This house has stood for over a century. Do you know what kept it standing? Not money, not status, love. Real love between real people who chose each other over and over again, through good times and bad. Your grandmother, he continued, his voice soft with memory, was a seamstress when she married my brother. The society families were scandalized, but she became the heart of this house, the light that made everything else worthwhile. You, Danielle, you're that light now. As if summoned by the mention of scandal, Daniel's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it and grimaced. My mother? Danielle asked. Worse. The society pages. Someone's already leaked news of our engagement. He showed them the headline, Hart heirs shocking romance with household staff. Danielle felt her stomach drop, but Daniel immediately deleted the notification and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Let them talk, he said firmly. Let them whisper and speculate and judge. In a week I'll be married to the woman I love, and their opinions will matter exactly as much as they do right now, which is not at all. But your business will adapt or find new leadership. I'm not my father, Danielle. I'm not building an empire at the expense of my happiness. He pulled her closer. I'm building a life with you. As the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, the garden was illuminated by soft landscape lighting that Edward had thoughtfully installed years ago. The roses glowed like jewels in the artificial twilight, and the fountain sang its gentle song of permanence and peace. I have something to confess, Danielle said suddenly. Daniel's body tensed slightly. What? I used to come out here at night sometimes, when you were traveling or working late. I'd sit on this bench and imagine what it would be like to belong here. Really belong, not just work here. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with wonder. I never imagined it could be this beautiful. What? The garden? No, being loved by you, being chosen by you, being enough for you. Daniel's response was to kiss her, deeply, thoroughly, with all the passion and promise and forever that words couldn't contain. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Edward was diplomatically examining the roses with intense concentration. So, Daniel said, his forehead resting against hers, this weekend? This weekend, she agreed. Small ceremony. Very small, just us, Edward, and Father Morrison. Perfect. He paused, then grinned with boyish excitement. Mrs. Hart is going to love being married to me. Danielle laughed, the sound carrying across the garden like music. Mr. Hart is going to love being married to me, too. As they stood there in the garden, holding each other under the stars, none of them noticed the shadow that briefly appeared at an upstairs window of the neighboring mansion, a shadow that belonged to someone who had been watching, listening, and planning. Because some storms pass quickly, but others gather strength in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at happiness that dares to shine too brightly. 6 months later, love doesn't end with I do. It begins there, growing stronger with each sunrise, deeper with each shared breath. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Hart mansion, casting golden patterns across the marble floors that Danielle Hart, still marveling at the sound of her married name, now walked as mistress rather than employee. But some things never changed. She still rose early, still found peace in the quiet rituals of morning, still believed that small acts of kindness could transform entire worlds. She paused in the doorway of the sunroom, watching her husband of 5 months tend to the orchids they now cared for together. Daniel had traded his perpetual suits for casual elegance, rolled-up sleeves, loosened tie, hair slightly mussed from sleep. The rigid control that had once defined him had softened into something more beautiful, contentment. You're staring, he said without looking up, but she could hear the smile in his voice. I'm admiring, she corrected, moving to join him among the flowers. There's a difference. He straightened, turning to face her with eyes that still held wonder when they looked at her, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, that she was his. Good morning, Mrs. Hart. Good morning, husband. She rose on her toes to kiss him, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Edward's already in the kitchen. He's making his famous pancakes. Special occasion? Every day with you is a special occasion. She paused, studying his face. But actually, yes. The Harrison Industries merger finalizes today. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not with the old tension, but with quiet satisfaction. Amazing what happens when you approach business as partnership instead of conquest. The Harrison merger had been Daniel's first major deal since choosing love over his mother's expectations. Instead of the aggressive tactics Vivian had taught him, he'd approached the negotiations with the same honesty and respect he'd learned to bring to his marriage. The result had been not just a successful business deal, but the foundation for lasting professional relationships built on mutual benefit rather than domination. "Your mother called yesterday," Danielle said gently, watching his reaction. "Did she?" Daniel's voice was carefully neutral. "What did she want? To invite us to Christmas dinner?" The silence that followed was heavy with months of estrangement, hurt, and slowly healing wounds. Vivian Hart had spent the first 3 months after their wedding staging various forms of protest, cutting social ties, freezing certain business relationships, making pronouncements about family loyalty to anyone who would listen. But time and Daniel's unshakable happiness had begun to wear down even her formidable resolve. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd discuss it with my husband." Danielle reached out, straightening his already perfect tie. "I also told her that any invitation would need to include an apology. To both of us, but especially to you." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "You told my mother she needed to apologize to me." "I told your mother that love requires accountability and that family isn't an excuse for cruelty." Danielle's voice carried the quiet strength that had only grown in the months since their wedding. "I may have been the help once, but I'm a heart now, and hearts protect each other." The pride in Daniel's expression was unmistakable. What did she say to that? That she was beginning to understand why her son fell in love with me. From the kitchen came the sound of Edward's cheerful humming, a gospel hymn that Danielle had taught him, one her grandmother used to sing while cooking. The older man had become more than just family. He'd become Danielle's closest friend and confidant, someone who understood that love could transform not just individuals, but entire family legacies. "There's something else," Danielle said, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. "What?" She looked up at him, her brown eyes bright with a secret that had been growing for weeks. "Dr. Waverley confirmed it yesterday. We are going to have a baby." The words hit Daniel like lightning. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, joy, wonder, and finally, overwhelming love. "A baby? A baby?" She smiled, tears threatening to spill over. "Due in late spring." Daniel's hands moved to frame her face, his touch reverent and amazed. "We're going to be parents. Are you happy?" "Happy?" His laugh was breathless, incredulous. "Danielle, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. I'm going to love this baby the way my father never knew how to love me. I know you are." She leaned into his touch. "They're going to be so lucky to have you as a father." From the kitchen doorway came the sound of deliberate throat clearing. Edward appeared, his silver hair catching the morning light, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to see dreams become reality. "I don't suppose this emotional conversation has anything to do with the pregnancy test I accidentally glimpsed in the bathroom wastebasket yesterday?" he asked mildly. Danielle laughed, the sound bright and musical. "You don't miss anything, do you?" "At my age, my dear, missing things is a luxury I can't afford." Edward's smile was radiant. "Congratulations. This house is going to be filled with the sound of children's laughter again." "Just like when Daniel was small?" Danielle asked. Edward's expression grew thoughtful. "Better. This child will grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally. They'll learn that kindness is strength, that love is the only legacy that truly matters." As if to prove his point, Daniel pulled Danielle closer, his hand moving to rest protectively over where their child was growing. The gesture was unconscious but profound, a promise to love and protect without conditions or expectations. "There's going to be so much to figure out," Danielle said, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of becoming parents. "We'll figure it out together," Daniel said firmly, "just like everything else. The nursery will need to be prepared, and we'll need to think about names and childcare arrangements for when I go back to work." "Danielle," Daniel's voice was gentle but firm, "you don't have to go back to work if you don't want to. We can afford for you to stay home with the baby or work part-time or whatever makes you happy. But I like working. I like feeling useful. Then work. Do whatever fulfills you. Just know that you have choices now. Choices I want you to make based on what brings you joy, not what you think you should do. Edward watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. This was what love looked like when it was healthy and whole. Two people supporting each other's dreams, creating space for individual growth within their shared life. Speaking of choices, Edward said, settling into his favorite chair, I have an announcement of my own. Both Daniel and Danielle turned to look at him, suddenly alert to the formal tone in his voice. I've decided to travel, Edward continued. Europe, maybe Asia. Places Margaret and I always talked about visiting but never quite managed to reach. For how long? Daniel asked, concern evident in his voice. As long as it takes to see everything I want to see. Edward's smile was peaceful but determined. I'm 75 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years of my life making sure you two found each other. Now that you have, it's time for me to find my own adventures. Uncle, the house will still be here when I get back, and so will you. But right now I want to see the northern lights and the cherry blossoms in Kyoto and the sunrise over the Santorini cliffs. His eyes grew distant with possibility. I want to live while I still can. Danielle felt tears prick her eyes. We'll miss you. And I'll miss you. But this isn't goodbye. It's see you later. Besides, Edward's grin turned mischievous, someone needs to go shopping for the most ridiculous baby gifts Europe has to offer. As they stood there in the sunroom, three people who had found family in the most unexpected ways, the morning light seemed to bless them with golden possibilities. Daniel's hand rested on Danielle's stomach, protecting their future. Edward planned adventures that would carry Margaret's memory to beautiful places, and Danielle felt, perhaps for the first time in her life, completely and utterly home. The orchids bloomed around them, white and pristine and enduring. Outside, New York City hummed with its usual chaos and ambition, but inside the Hart Mansion, love had created something rare and precious, a family built not on obligation or expectation, but on choice, respect, and the daily decision to see the best in each other. 6 months ago, Danielle Moore had been invisible. Today, Danielle Hart was the center of her own beautiful life, surrounded by love that asked nothing of her except to be exactly who she was. And that, she thought as Daniel kissed her forehead and Edward hummed quietly in his chair, was more than enough. It was everything. Sometimes the greatest fairy tales are the ones we write ourselves. One choice, one brave moment, one act of love at a time. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? One built on power and expectations, or one built on love and acceptance? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.